Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. The title is Recovery from Mother-Enmeshed Men, Covert Sexual Trauma Consequences and Shame Resiliency Needs, presented by Doug Sorensen. Let me tell you a little bit about Center for Healthy Sex. We're hosting this event, and we're located in Los Angeles. We're a sex therapy center. We treat sexual dysfunction, sex addiction, and couples counseling. And we have an intensive outpatient program that's pretty well known around the world. Our next calendar is we have an 11-day women's sex and love addiction intensive from June 27th to July 8th. We have an 11-day men's sex and love addiction intensive from July 25th through August 5th. And we have 2 weeks from July 11th to 22nd that is open right now, and it's open for either men or women. And we also offer a Partners Intensive as well. So if you have any interest in that, or if you'd like to refer a client, you can call us at any time at 310-843-9902. I'd also like to plead our case to have you buy our book, Mirror of Intimacy. It's available on Amazon. We've got about 10 more copies left of this amazing hardcover version with the amazing purple pages in the middle. And we just won the Eric Hoffer Award, Book Award, Best of Self-Published of the Year, just a week and a half ago. So we're really happy about that. So let me introduce you to Doug Sorensen. We're really happy to have him join us today. He's a licensed clinical social worker, a certified sex addiction therapist and supervisor, and a certified Daring Way facilitator and consultant. And he has a private practice in Houston, Texas. His clinical focus has been with individuals seeking to rebuild their lives from the consequences of childhood trauma and addiction. Douglas began training with Patrick Carnes in the outpatient application of his task-centered treatment model in 1996. His clinical approach has evolved to include Pia Melody's developmental immaturity model for treating childhood trauma. And Doug is a certified facilitator and consultant of the Daring Way model, which was developed from the research of Dr. Brene Brown, and he's been a member of the Daring Way Senior Facility since February 2014. So welcome, Doug. We're really excited to host your webinar. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know if I've ever done anything that involves a computer or a microphone that I haven't had. The moment we had a few minutes ago, we were trying to figure out how we were going to get sound going. So, yeah. So anyhow, thanks to Tom, to the Center for Healthy Sex, to Alex Katahakis, and to Douglas Evans for the opportunity to do this. Do this presentation today. I have really been looking forward to it. And this is an issue that, is something that I have some personal connection with too. So when we talked about doing this, when the opportunity arose, I chose this talk because we're going to talk about some things that people tend to struggle with whether they're in recovery or not. The covert incest part, the covert sexual abuse part, the trauma part, and the struggles that go along with that, particularly for somebody in recovery. And when I say recovery, I'm talking sexual addiction recovery here primarily. That's personal for me. And so it's just good to be here. My introduction to this issue and the reality of it came in the form of a book suggested by my therapist at the time, who, after hearing some of my story, thought I might relate to it, and he was right. He was correct. Silently Seduced by Dr. Ken Adams put words to what I'd experienced growing up as an enmeshed son of a mother whose needs came before mine as a son. He also described the emotional and relational minefield I'd been living in as an adult and the hopelessness I felt as I tried to navigate my addiction recovery. And that was a big part of it because I was struggling and I didn't understand why. So a few years later, I reconnected with a colleague friend who'd gotten her PhD and was doing research into how people get vulnerable and connect with authenticity, and later coined the phrase wholeheartedness. Dr. Brene Brown was finding in her research that the chief obstacle to connection was shame, that everybody had it. We couldn't get rid of it. That I already knew that because I've been trying and failing to get rid of it. But that we could learn the practice of what she called shame resilience to help us deal with it. And so let's take a few minutes and go over some of the things in the title, so you've got some sense of what we're going to be talking about. First one, covert sexual trauma. And its consequences. Covert sexual trauma I'll be referring to today is the boundary violation of the son by his mother, in which the mother's emotional and relational needs become the priority, like I was describing a moment ago. This represents a boundary violation by the mother. It's the violation of the generational boundary between parent and child, isolating the child from his siblings and peers and alienating him from his young, undeveloped psychological self. It's a pretty lonely place to be. The son, in this grown-up-like role, feels important, and that's the seduction of it. That child feels important. They feel special, but it's a false empowerment that has no developmental foundation. That child is trying to do something that they haven't the capacity to do. And so let's see here. There we go. So covert sexual trauma, the son's relationship with the mother becomes embedded as an unconscious template, controlling his feelings, thoughts, and behavior, and distorting his developing beliefs and expectations. When we're in single-digit years, that's where we're getting to know ourselves. It's where we're getting to know about the world. We're learning about what we believe people see when they look at us, and so those thoughts, beliefs, those thoughts and behaviors and feelings become distorted, but they get parked in there. And then later, when we get a little bit older, when we're trying to do something that we want to do, follow our own path, the child will feel trapped, disloyal, guilty. So let's see. The next slide, Mother-Enmeshed Men. Okay, this is a term coined by Dr. Ken Adams, who in his book, When He's Married to Mom, which is an excellent book if you have a chance to get it and read it. Not the most comfortable read in the world when if you relate to this issue. But this is a term coined by Dr. Adams to describe the pervasive consequences of the covert sexual abuse dynamic as it manifests itself in the adult man's life. And they are pervasive. So shame resiliency needs next. Shame resilience is the practice of understanding and dealing with our shame so that we can feel a sense of connection and belonging with the world around us. Otherwise, we can be an outsider to our own life and our own story, because shame tells us that we don't belong. We don't deserve belonging. That we're not deserving and worthy of connection with the people around us. That's why it feels so awful and isolating. And then the last one, recovery. So recovery, I'm referring to, in this case today, to addiction recovery, specifically sexual addiction recovery, because that is where I've seen the greatest struggle with this issue. I chose the topic because I see its consequences every week in my office and because I've struggled with the same consequences. So let me tell you a little bit about me. My entry into recovery began in AA when I was 35. I had a therapist at the time who thought I had a problem. And I stuck around long enough to find out that, yeah, I did. It took a little while, but even when I went into AA, when I went into that therapist's office the first time, I knew that it wasn't going to be limited to AA. We were going to be having to dig a little bit deeper than that. And so 18 months after I went to AA, I started going to SLAA meetings, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And at the time here in Houston, there weren't very many meetings. They had an SLA meeting on Tuesday nights that I went to, and but I didn't really want to have to deal with that stuff. I'd been dreading it, and at the meetings, which unfortunately were small, so I couldn't hide in the back row, and they were men's meetings, that would suck. And what if I saw somebody I knew? Okay, so like I was saying, I went to the meetings and I started talking about how I'd learned to numb out with sex long before I'd ever taken my first drink. Long before. And how much fear and shame, and if I'm honest with myself, rage, I'd felt for as far back as I could remember. I knew that I was struggling with this. I knew I felt different about how I looked at sex, how I related to sex. But it was different for me. I knew that when I was, possibly even before I was a teenager. So after a while, I was going to several meetings a week, SLAA and AA, and I was fumbling through my step work. I was going to group therapy. I was doing all the stuff that I was telling my clients to do. I was doing the same thing. I was sober in AA. I hadn't relapsed. I wasn't going to strip clubs anymore. That had been part of my acting out. But my porn use had continued, and less frequently, but it was still there, and I was struggling. What I was struggling with, more than I realized, was how disconnected I felt. At 41, I met a woman in an AA meeting. By the way, 6:30 meetings in AA, that's where you meet the real serious drunks. And so we met there. And but I'll tell you, by that point in my life, I had essentially resigned myself to the likelihood that I wouldn't get married. I couldn't figure out why I could help other people deal with this, and I wasn't somehow getting it. I'd been afraid of girls when I was a kid and a teenager, and I'd been afraid of getting close to women as an adult, so I couldn't even imagine, given my history of relationship disasters. Surprisingly, this time we seemed to progress along pretty well. It was the first time where I actually thought maybe there is a higher power, because this seemed to have a life of its own, and it was moving along pretty well to the extent that I could get out of my own way. My therapist's weekly reality checks helped form a crack in the certainty that I had. I kept saying to her, I don't know what it is, but I keep expecting a train wreck. And so she said at the time, okay, so when you think that, you just send me an email or you call me or we'll talk about the meeting, get a reality check from me. And I was able to do that. And so what I was experiencing was all those inner beliefs and expectations coming up and trying to keep me from getting close to somebody because I was terrified. I didn't know I was terrified to the extent that I was. And we got married. And I was 43. I got married for the first time, and my wife added as she was typing this, and hopefully for the last, and I agree. And so, but this had been a struggle that I had dealt with through all of my adult life. That I would want to get close. That's a basic human need. And at the same time, as I started to get close, especially with women, but I would start self-sabotaging. I'd start finding all sorts of reasons why I needed to leave and check out. And then I'll just add my professional training at the time with Dr. Carnes, Dr. Patrick Carnes, had me learning more and more about addiction treatment, specifically sexual addiction and the role shame played in keeping sex addicts from getting help. I knew many of the clients, my clients had experienced childhood trauma, much of it sexual, and they tended to minimize its connection to their sexual acting out. And besides, they didn't like talking about it. And I could relate completely. Even though I had not been acting out with any of my bottom line behavior, I still wasn't feeling very good about myself at all. Although I loved my wife and my son and was happy as I knew how to be in a marriage, I was still struggling with feeling unworthy. And that made me feel even more shame. I felt shame about feeling shame. And so this is where I kept getting stuck. And so this is a quote by Dan Hill in his book, Affect Regulation Theory. Dissociated shame permeates insecure personalities, yet despite its ubiquity, is veiled to those who suffer it and is often veiled to those who treat them as well. And so, and one of the consequences, one of the significant consequences of covert trauma of any kind, but I think in particular covert sexual trauma, is that it's so insidious and it's harder to identify. And in my case, no one, I didn't have somebody who molested me physically, but I had the symptoms, and I would look back and not know why I was struggling. I couldn't connect my history to explain what was going on in the present day. So this is, these are a couple quotes by Brene Brown. When we deny our stories, they define us. When we own our stories, we get to write the ending. And this is where we usually encounter shame, defined by Dr. Brown as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and then therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. And that denial of our story isn't necessarily conscious. I didn't know I had a story I was denying. I was talking to somebody earlier today about how he had been in recovery for a while and had a previous copy of Facing the Shadow, and I asked him to do an exercise in it, and he said, "Oh, great! I'll just kind of go back and I'll just go and get the stuff that I wrote before." And he said, "I went back in the book, and there was nothing there; it was empty." And so that's shame. That means that we're afraid to venture into this uncharted territory internally. And I'm going to add that, our brain's number one job is to protect us from potential dangers. They don't have to be actual, just potential. And its reference point is an archive of our trauma history tucked very nicely away in our midbrain. And so when we're, involved in an interaction, or we see or hear, our senses respond to something, a little bit of that data goes to our midbrain. And while our thinking and reasoning and relational part of our brain is still gathering data, our midbrain is already deciding if we need to take some kind of action if there's a threat involved, and it's instantaneous. And so, because our brain remembers what happened, my brain was remembering what happened relationally. It perceived one of my caregivers, my primary caregivers, as a threat. And so the notion of getting close to somebody, getting intimate, emotionally and physically, was perceived by my brain as dangerous. Now, consciously, I really wanted to be in a relationship. I really wanted to be in a marriage. And yet, like I was saying earlier, I'd pretty much given up because I didn't know how I was going to do it. It was just so hard and so much work to stay connected to somebody. And so, to assure our protection from past trauma, our midbrain employs shame to block access to our story, much like a muscle-bound bouncer restricting entry to a New York nightclub. And so, and I was looking through some pictures of muscle-bound bouncers that might look similar to my shame, and he seemed to qualify. And so part of it for me at the time, and part of what happens for a lot of clients that I see, we don't even know there's a story we're not accessing. We've got shame about something we've done, shame about, past actions or behaviors, but this goes back far enough where it's pre-verbal. And our brain does not differentiate between overt and covert trauma. It just registers it as a threat that we can't control, and it's going to take over. So, Tom, are there any questions that have come up so far? We're about 20 minutes into this, and I'm wondering if anybody has a question they want to ask.
Hi, Doug. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I've had some audio issues myself. So we have a question from Josie in Oregon. Is this more common for men who had single mothers? Does the mom not having a partner for support make her more likely to use her son for emotional, physical support? And is narcissism an aspect of this 100% of the time, or not always?
Okay. It's a good question. I think that if somebody is a single parent, one of the challenges is, you've got your own issues to deal with, and you don't have somebody there helping you. It can be easy, especially depending upon your own life history. If you've had some boundary, if you've experienced your boundaries being violated in the past, it can be more difficult to notice your own tendency to do that. It's a lot of work to be a single parent and to put that child's needs first. And we can get into a lot of shame about how we're parenting. I'm going to talk a little bit about shame triggers. Shame keeps us from asking for help. It keeps us from telling anybody that there's a problem. And so sometimes we don't know that we're doing it. I know that my son had a friend who, when he was in elementary school, He had a friend of his his parents got divorced. He was an only kid, and at some point, his mother was telling him he was the man of the house now. And I just shuddered because I remember hearing that. And even though my mom wasn't a single parent, it's just harder. It's harder, and I think there's a vulnerability to it. And so if somebody is able to kind of ask for some feedback or get some reality checks from the people around them and talk about it, that's a big help. That's part of taking care of that child is checking out. My son is depending upon me to take care of myself. Am I taking care of myself so that I can take care of him? Hope that answers it. Anybody else?
Yeah, Doug, here's a question about your story from Matt in San Antonio. He writes that you mentioned you were sober from bottom line behaviors and yet still dabbling in porn, and then you met and married. Did that marriage dissolve because of sex addiction and porn? And also,
No.
how did you finally end all of the acting out behaviors? If you did, what was it that finally brought you to and through all of the acting out?
That's a good question. And I was using at the time I was referring to. Obviously you heard in that I had some distorted thinking about what was a bottom line behavior, and some of my acting out was just enough to get me out of my feelings. It might have been rather than the hardcore porn videos and such that I might have been doing in the past. It would have been maybe renting movies that I knew had a sexual theme to it, or something that my denial could convince me that it was okay. And so part of what the struggle was for me was that I had a lot of feelings stirring up inside that I didn't know about, that I was struggling with, like I was saying a minute ago. I was struggling with the closeness with this relationship, and I was feeling, I think, overwhelmed and didn't know how to identify it and didn't know how to talk to somebody about it. And so the marriage is intact. We've been married over 20 years now. But yeah, there was a struggle there. And some of it was attending to some of my underlying trauma. And, I'll say too that, and I think some of the clients that I see, I work with in sexual recovery, get so worried about, struggling, that they're going to lose their sobriety date. And I think, sobriety date's important, but I also think that, when we get sober, we're going to start addressing the stuff that we were acting out over, and that's going to bring up feelings, and it's going to bring up baggage, and some of it's going to be conscious, but I'll tell you, more of it's not going to be conscious, and we're going to start reacting and not know why, and we're susceptible to acting out, we're susceptible to relapse. And so I think that's part of the struggle I was in at times. And I hope that answers your question too. Thanks. It was a good question.
Yeah, Doug.
So
Matt says, yes, that's exactly where I'm at in this point in my recovery. Ugh.
it's a hard spot to be in because we look around and we think, I've been in recovery for a while. I think I should be handling this. We've got this expectation of ourselves in terms of how we're performing. And a lot of times that expectation isn't terribly humane. It it doesn't take into account that now we're tapping into some stuff that we've been self-medicating probably for a couple decades, and that there's this whole part of our story that lives beneath what we know on a conscious level. And so we start critiquing ourselves and we start shaming ourselves, and lo and behold, we're right back to what got us there in the first place, feeling isolated, not worthy, and get me out of my feelings. So, okay, let me go a little bit and let me see. Okay. So one of the things that I had learned, and let me just say too that my struggle with shame was much greater than I realized. Like I said, it was not the shame about, oh gosh, I feel a lot of shame about something I've done, or it was this kind of overarching mindset that, or belief system of, I'm not worthy. I am not worthy. I can't imagine why anybody would want to be close to me. If somebody was nice to me, I liked it, and I doubted it, and I wondered, what do they want? What are they up to? And so somebody moving close to me has all this, my defenses were working overtime. So I'd also learned pretty much around this time that through Brené's research that there is a positive link between shame proneness and addiction. And certainly there's a positive link between trauma and addiction, sexual addiction in particular. Well, not just, but certainly it's what we see. A lot of trauma history among our clients. And so, and Rhonda Deering, Dr. Rhonda Deering, who is up in Buffalo, I think it's State University of New York in Buffalo, has done a ton of writing and research about shame and guilt. And so that was a reference Brené was making to her work. The link between shame and addiction becomes a vicious cycle that is difficult to change. And that's out of I Thought It Was Just Me, one of Brené's first books. Many of us have spent years using what Brené calls strategies of disconnection. She describes them as shame shields, which are, there are three of them: moving away, moving towards, and moving against. They come from the Stone Center up at Wellesley, where they did research about how people respond to shame, and found that, when somebody goes into a shame attack, they're going to tend to respond in patterns. It can be to withdraw, which was what I was certainly familiar with. It can be to move towards, which isn't what it sounds like. It's actually people pleasing, or it can be to move against, which is fighting shame with shame. And so let me back up a second. So many of us have spent years using what Brené called the strategies of disconnection to fight our shame and deal with unmet needs for empathy. Getting stuck in these disconnections not only moves us away from authenticity, but the stuck part plays a central role in the relationship between shame and addiction. Did I mention, I think I probably did, that I was getting stuck and felt perpetually stuck. And so my clients would go to a meeting, and they'd come back and they go, I hear these guys talking in meetings about you know, about their own abuse and how it was for them. And man, I'm sitting there and I'm feeling terrible for them. It was horrible. Um, and then there's this pause, and he'll say, and I didn't go through any of that. In fact, my mother loved me to death. I remember saying that. I don't have a history like these other guys. I'm just sick. I'm a pervert. That's the kind of stuff that people will come in and describe feeling or thinking. And I can remember thinking the same thing. What the hell's wrong with me? These other guys have a disease. I'm just screwed up. I remember at the time asking my father if I had ever been sexually abused as a kid. He kind of looked at me with some surprise. He thought, God, are you off the wall or what? He wouldn't have said that, but it would have been what he was thinking. If to his knowledge anybody had ever laid a hand on me, and he said no. But I had the symptoms of somebody who had experienced childhood sexual abuse, and I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't understand it. Why do I have those symptoms when I don't have that history? And even though I had been exposed to reading Silently Seduced, I wasn't connecting the dots, and so I felt lost. Now, if you think about, I grew up in a family where I'm the surrogate spouse to my mom, and in fact, people would ask me, how long have you been a therapist? I'm 63 now. And so I would say, I started about 5, so that's about 58 years. Because I would hear from my mother, all the different ways that my father was a jackass, and all the problems she had with him. And I was the only person she could talk to. That's pretty heady stuff for a kid to hear. Oh, man, I'm pretty important. But as an adult, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm supposed to know how to fix this stuff, because I still have that belief system back there that says I'm special. I'm supposed to know how to fix this stuff without letting anybody know that I'm broken. I felt shame about feeling lost, and I felt shame about feeling shame, and I was too ashamed to tell anybody. And so Christine Courtois, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right. Excellent book. It's not you, it's what happened to you. This is a quote from her. Traumatic experience, especially early life attachment trauma, is a primary contributor to a skewed sense of self-worth. This can result in the development of a shamed sense of self, the belief that one is inherently flawed, defective, not good enough, and unworthy of love and belonging. And it's in there, and it's buried underneath a lot of history and a lot of defenses and a lot of distorted thinking. And so what Brene Brown's work opened my eyes and all of my senses to was the pervasive impact my underlying and, like I said, often not conscious shame was having upon my efforts and struggles in my relationships, in my recovery, and most importantly, in my efforts to connect with myself. I didn't have a clue. I remember going into an AA meeting when I first started back in 1988, and somebody asking me in the first couple of weeks, they asked me more than this, but one time I remember in particular, how are you doing? And my reactions were kind of like this. They said, how are you doing? I kind of put up the poker face that I had gotten pretty good at putting up. I froze behind that. I froze because I didn't know the answer. I didn't even know where to look. And then I came up with something. Probably, oh, I'm fine. That's how I live my day in and day out. Coming up with something, putting something out there, and having no connection with with myself. So much of, let's talk about the addiction recovery process for a second. Much of the addiction recovery process is about facing and owning our stories, taking responsibility for our actions, making amends, moving forward in our lives, learning to live an integrated life where our fragmentation is brought back together into a whole and accountable person. One of the first steps in this process is learning to tolerate uncomfortable emotions like shame. And I think shame's at the head of that list. And sometimes shame can be, it's tricky. It can kind of camouflage itself. We can feel fear or we can feel anger, but actually the way I look at that is that's kind of shame doing a scouting mission, you know. The fear is fear of being exposed. The anger can be the belief that somebody intends to expose our failing or our unworthiness. But really the bottom line to both of those is shame. As I said earlier, my aversion to self-reflection had allowed the story embedded in my own history to own me, to pull the levers beneath my decisions and generally hijack my adult life. This is where shame resilience developed from Dr. Brown's research on connection. And actually, she was doing research on connection and intimacy. And what she realized, she wasn't going to be able to do that without addressing the obstacles to shame, to intimacy and connection and vulnerability. So her work on connection, vulnerability, and authenticity can open our access to the story living inside us. In addition to developing an understanding of shame and its consequences, shame resilience involves the development of a critical awareness regarding some things like, how does my experience of shame manifest itself in my body? How does it manifest itself at all? Do I tend to withdraw? Do I tend to bow up and get ready to fight? Do I people please? What's the self-talk going inside? A lot of times we don't even know we've got self-talk. We just think that's just is. It's our left brain having a field day on what it thinks we should be doing and how we should be doing it. That's self-talk. Shame prone. Shame has got the microphone in our head a lot of the time. So what are my shame triggers? These are kinds of things that we learn in recovery. What are my triggers? So what triggers my shame? And what are my go-to reactions when I feel shame, like I was saying a moment ago? And then, this is really important, identifying who I can talk to and with when I'm in shame. Because the last thing we need is somebody going, oh, it's going to be okay, or oh, you shouldn't be worrying about that. You're such a neat person. We need somebody who's going to know what we're talking about, and so that we can practice reaching out. It takes conscious effort and daily practice to change our shame-based self-talk, especially since those negative scripts are automatic and have been around for so long. Many of us have relied on our addictions to numb our feelings as the painful echoes of our childhood remained our most trusted landmark for navigating the present. In other words, it's our primary reference point, and shame sounds believable and it sounds authoritative, and so we buy what it's selling. Regrettably, our disconnection from our inner selves unwittingly allows our early trauma-based truths to determine our paths moving forward into our personal and relational lives. Shame resilience teaches us that we can learn to notice and navigate through, let me get the next slide, that we can learn to notice and navigate through our experience of shame and use it to promote connection with ourselves and trust in others. It's a practice. It's a practice, it's a practice, it's a practice. It doesn't mean we won't feel shame. This isn't about shame resistance. It's shame resilience. We're going to feel shame because it's hardwired. But the more we practice shame resilience, the quicker we can move through it. And it opens the door that leads into our story. So anybody have a question at that point? Because this is what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes comes from Dr. Brown's work around how people get themselves up off the ground after they fall on their face, whatever that might look like, relationally, professionally, whatever. And how some people are able to retain their ability to be vulnerable and connect. And so, Tom, you got anybody who's got a question?
Yeah, Doug, we have a comment from Nola in San Diego. The multi-layered shame you're discussing is often compounded even more in people of color because of the humiliation experienced because of racism.
Yes. Oh. Funny you should say this. I was listening to a TED Talk last night about, I can't remember his name, but it was about his experience as growing up in South Africa and all the stuff he had learned to be true about, the people that were around him who were dark skinned and he was terrified of. Anyhow, it's challenging because there are different cultural norms and different expectations that we may or may not be aware of. And it can get compounded in therapy too. If a therapist isn't asking about, okay, so how are your perceptions of what we're talking about impacted culturally? Because I, as a Caucasian male, am going to have to learn from you how do you see this? How do you relate to this issue? I had a guy that I was seeing for a long time who I was trying to get to meetings, and he finally went. He said, "You have no idea." I mean, this was talk about humbling. He said, "You have no idea what you're asking me to do." He said, "My house got shot up. I grew up in Mississippi, and our house got shot up. And when I walked into that meeting, he was African American. When I walked into that meeting, and I'm the only dark-skinned man there. Man, I can't do that without just getting all defended up. And if you really think I'm going to ask one of those guys to be a sponsor, you've got another thing coming." I was floored. I had no clue. And so, yeah, the sense of isolation can be compounded cross-culturally significantly. So I hope that helps answer that question. It was a good question. Anybody else?
Yeah, Tristan from Denver asks, do you see a correlation between love addiction and love avoidance with maternally enmeshed men? And if so, which of the two is predominant?
I think it's which is predominant, avoidance or the compulsive pursuit or the okay. Well, I think it can flip-flop back and forth. I know that I was a pursuer until somebody would turn around and say, "Okay, big boy, here I am." And then all of a sudden, I mean, you could hear the brakes squealing. I had a guy who I saw early in my practice who had very enmeshed family history, a lot of what we're talking about today. And he said, "I don't know what the deal is." He said, "I start dating somebody and I really am very seductive and convincing." He used words, but he puts on the hard sell. And then when they tell me that they love me, they change. Something about them changes. Needless to say, he didn't stay too long, but our practice, I had about 4 ex-girlfriends of his in the practice coming in, who were all reporting the same thing. And so we flip. They're two sides of the same coin. And I think with sex addiction too, you know, my sex addiction could morph back and forth between compulsive pursuit of sexual behavior or compulsive pursuit of relational behavior. I think they're peas in the same pot. I think that addiction can just, it's creative. I mean, it'll find different ways to manifest itself. And if we stop one, it's going to look for another way. So the goal of the process there's a curriculum that goes with Renee's work on Rising Strong, which is an awesome book. It's really an awesome book. The written book and the audio book is awesome. The goal of this process is to rise from our falls, overcome our mistakes, and face hurt in a way that brings us more wisdom and more wholeheartedness. And to learn from our mistakes. I think this is a huge issue in sexual recovery, is that we get so afraid of making a mistake, or we have so much shame about having to reset a sobriety date, or we're terrified about the prospect of relapse, or we're terrified that if we make a mistake, we're going to lose a primary relationship, and those are all real. Those are all real. At the same time, we learn from our mistakes, and the trick is, how do I find some room to for myself to do the best I can to establish a foundation of recovery, which I need to do, and also notice how the other ways in which I'm likely to act out and address those, but also learn to have some compassion for the likelihood that I'm going to make some mistakes. And so the first part of this Rising Strong process, and the reason I'm adding this is I just went through it with a few group members earlier today. As addicts, we're pretty disconnected, not only from ourselves emotionally, but we're disconnected from ourselves physically too, which sounds ironic since we've acted out with our feelings. And so this first part of the Rising Strong process is acknowledging, okay, I'm hooked by something. If you think about the word reckoning, it's finding out, where am I at on the path, or where am I at on finding our spot on the map. And so it's in this case, it's where we determine or clarify our location in a particular moment. And it's being able to say, okay, I'm hooked, something's hit me, or I've hit something, what's going on? And so you can see right there too that there's that mindfulness is a big part of this. Let's see. So once we acknowledge that we've been hooked by something, that we're reacting, and something's going on, she talks about it, an SFD, the politically correct version is stormy first draft, but Brene refers to it as a shitty first draft. It's a brief, unfiltered, messy, embarrassing, gosh, I hope my friends never see this, description of an incident as we've experienced it. And the goal is to be honest and authentic about your inner experience, not to sound healthy, not to sound functional, not to get it right. You're going to know you're on track if you want to burn it after you're done. It's messy, because that's what happens inside us. What's going on inside us is messy. And that's where the shame kicks up, is that we notice the messiness, and we've got all these messages about, I should have my act together by now. Hell, I've been in recovery X number of years, and, I shouldn't be struggling. I shouldn't be thinking what I think. I shouldn't be feeling what I feel. And so we use prompts such as, okay, what happened? In fact, we've got a page that Jenny has organized for our clients in our group that has four prompts in the front page, and somebody can start with any one of them. Now, with a group of recovering sex addicts, usually the easiest one to start with is, what do I want to do? Okay, I want to get laid. I want to have something to eat. Get me a drink. I want to hide out. Get me the hell out of here. So that's frequently the first one that people are going to be able to identify. And but that's all we need. If we can identify one, we can get to the other. I had a client the other night refer to this as an algorithm, and I had no idea what he was talking about, but it seemed to make sense to him. And so that we find out one point in this, and if I've got a sense of what do I want to do, then I may be able to identify what am I feeling. So if I want to run and hide, I'm probably scared. And what story am I making up in my head? This prompts us to develop this inner observer and to start noticing it. Practice just putting pen to paper on this is it's an executive function that helps us gain some perspective over our internal experience. And so if I can find the answer to one of these, I can probably get to the answer of all of them. You'll notice it's similar to kind of debriefing a slip or several different ways to approach this. But I'm just saying that the way we've used, and it's been working really well, is with this Rising Strong format. And so so we've answered those first four questions. What happened? What am I feeling? What do I want to do? And what am I making up in my head? So, but there's more to the story. So what more do I need to learn and understand about the situation? What are the facts? We were just doing this in group an hour and a half ago, and somebody was working at an issue, and you could see the clarity come to his face as he was going through. What are the facts of the story? And what assumptions am I making? What am I making up about this? What am I assuming? What am I thinking is going to happen? And then what more do I need to learn and understand about the other people in the story? That one of the things that came up earlier was, geez, if I ask my wife and son for help in doing some of the things that I need to do before we go on a trip, they'll help me, and they won't judge me for it. He was assuming that if he didn't handle it all himself, he would be a failure, and that's an echo from his history. So digging deeper still, what more do I need to learn and understand about myself? This is some of the heavy lifting. What's underneath my reaction or response, and what am I really feeling? And what part did I play, if I played any at all? Even if we don't think we have, sometimes it's worth taking a look at this. And at any point in this, we can encounter shame. And so then we go back to shame resilience. Okay, what just triggered me? What am I telling myself? And then the last one, this is the Big Kahuna. What's the last question is, what needs to change if I want to live a more integrated, wholehearted, authentic life? Which is why we get into recovery. Now, I've never understood why when I would go to an AA meeting, and somebody would start, moaning and groaning about somebody sharing an emotional problem or a feeling problem. I mean, we're in recovery to heal all the broken pieces, and that means reintegrating and and finding ourselves in the wreckage of these defenses that we've been living with. And so the process of taking what we've learned from our struggles, what's true, what do I need to do, and writing our own new ending is referred to it in the Rising Strong process as the revolution. This isn't an exercise, like I was saying before, with regard to shamelessly. It's not an exercise we can do just a few times and then live happily ever after and say, great, that's done. Boy, I'm glad it's over. Let's celebrate. Somebody get a beer. That's not it. This is going to be a practice. And it's a difficult commitment to make because many of us have relied on our addictions to numb our feelings. It's how we protected ourselves. Regrettably, our disconnection from our inner selves unwittingly allowed our early trauma-based truths to pull the levers. And learning this process and beginning to use it as a practice allows us to move from intimidation and fear to curiosity and hope. Something's going on. I'm hooked. I wonder what's going on. Instead of, oh crap, let me just go check out and zone out in front of the TV. To find out what's going on inside me, which is frankly not something that most of us have had much experience with. And you don't do this, believe me, you don't do this right in the beginning of recovery. This is something that evolves over time, and we're going to have a learning curve. This is about being committed to making this a practice, the Rising Strong process, and learning shame resilience. So this provides tools to help us own our story and unpack the truth. And we can move out from underneath the suffocating consequences of our traumatic childhood enmeshment, empowering us to choose how we want to live, move forward, live our authentic lives one day at a time. You know, we deserve to have happy lives, and we work our butts off in recovery, and there's a point to it. It's not just about not acting out. It's about finding ourselves and learning how to be true to ourselves, and finding out what that means, and being able to tell somebody, I have no clue. So is there anything else, Tom? I know we're bumping up at 3 o'clock, or I guess 1 o'clock your time.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I think you've answered most of the other questions, but I'll give a representative question from Paulette, Massachusetts, and maybe you can take it through the Rising Strong process. She asks, when intimacy is so uncomfortable and you want to get away from intimacy, how do you change those feelings and get to like intimacy?
Okay, so that would be part of the practice. That's going to evolve as I practice this. As I practice it on, I would consider that to be a $50 issue. We start practicing this with 50 cent and $1 issues that come up, so that we get accustomed to the practice. And sometimes this process takes, what I described as a rumble, kind of being in there and unpacking our story and finding out where we're blocked and what's true. It can take a while. And so by a while, I'm talking months, years, of committing to, okay, so when I start to get close to you, I notice that I want to pull away. I want to start a fight. I want to act out. I want to whatever. I start looking around the room to see who else I might want to be with. And so if we're committed to, okay, so what's going on with me? First of all, as I would imagine, you're going to have some shame to deal with. I don't want to admit that. I don't want to admit that I'm having all those feelings. Well, we've got to be able to dig in there And so dealing with the shame component of it, and so that we can get access to our story. And for a lot of us in sexual recovery, I think the first part of this process, the dealing with the obstructed pathway, got to get that bouncer to move off to the side so that we can begin to navigate into what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and be able to talk about it. And so I think it really is just a matter of learning how to practice this, and then committing to do that. And frankly, it means taking the time to do it, being willing to do it when you just soon do something else. It's hard work, and I'm going to tell you that my wife practiced this more diligently than I did at first. She trained in this as well. And Jenny Sorensen is my wife and my colleague here at the office. And some of it was seeing how she was approaching stuff that was coming up differently. Stuff that was coming up between us, she was approaching it differently. And a lot of it was using this model. And even so, talk about a vignette of my life. I was teaching this and not practicing it myself, and so I started to practice it too. And lo and behold, what do you know? It works. And so I think it really is. If there's both people in a coupleship, if they're familiar with this and they're practicing it, you can really talk about. You can navigate your way through stuff that you used to get stuck on before, and that's hopeful. That's hopeful. I mean, what we start doing is we start amassing a history of success on that, where our memory banks aren't just stored with, oh shit, don't walk down this road because you know how that's going to turn out. It's that we start remembering, okay, I've ventured into this territory before, and I got somewhere with it. It really is just about the willingness to step in and make it a practice. And by the way, I want to tell you that my wife helped me. I've got ADD, and so my organizational skills are somewhere between slim and none. And she helped me organize this material, and I'm greatly appreciative. So anyhow, anything else?
I think that's it. We do have a question from Paul from Mississippi. He's wondering, can people contact you at your website, dougsorensen.net, to get the slides from this lecture?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
sure.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doug.